Welcome everyone to our session, Notebooks Deep Dive. My name is Alan Yu, and I'm a program manager on the Microsoft Azure Data Studio team, and I'm joined today with Julie Koesmarno as well as Vasu Bhog. We have a very packed agenda for all of you, and we'll start off by me giving a quick overview of the Notebooks landscape. Next, we'll have Vasu to give an in-depth presentation on our latest investments around notebook parameterization. In addition to that, I will also give a demo of .NET Interactive and kind of show the latest enhancements in VS Code and eventually bringing this experience over to Azure Data Studio. And then finally, Julie will finish us off by giving a demo of Azure Monitor Logs, as well as giving an in-depth view of the TSG Ops framework using notebooks. In the notebooks landscape, more and more you're starting to see notebooks being this prominent user experience for our customers, especially in the data world. And when we first got started on this journey, with the release of SQL Server 2019, which was the first time that we would be shipping SQL alongside Spark, we wanted to make sure that with this data science scenarios, that data scientists were able to use Jupyter notebooks with Python kernel, which is what they're very used to. But over time, as we began to show and do additional investments over our notebooks experience, it turns out that our very large SQL customer base actually really loved the idea of notebooks. I could see where they could incorporate it into their pipelines. And so when they first tried out these notebooks, there was a big pain point when they tried to make it work with SQL because they had to rely on things known as Python magic, which basically gives you the ability to make connections to SQL and run queries, but it lacks many things that you would expect to see from a rich GUI SQL experience. And so after carefully doing user studies and reaching out to the SQL community, we decided to create the first ever dedicated SQL kernel. And with the SQL kernel, what this brings is IntelliSense, syntax highlighting, and also tabular results grids that allows you to get the full SQL experience inside of the Jupyter Notebooks world. And as we continue to invest in SQL scenarios and think about how do SQL users use these notebooks, we realized there were so many different areas for us to consider for notebook investments. So for example, we've been able to leverage notebooks to make it easy for people to deploy Azure data services, such as SQL Server, Azure SQL, and so on. And we've also found it to be a very useful UI in order to create these rich troubleshooting pipelines, which Julie will be demoing later on. We've also seen it as notebooks as documentation and great training material. We see opportunities for collaboration, especially with source control. We've also seen, for the typical data workflows that you may be familiar with for data scientists. And then finally, just more and more operational notebooks where we can execute as jobs, do testing, and things like that. And what's really great about these scenarios is that it's really cross-cutting across many different Microsoft experiences and customers. And so when we kind of look at where notebooks are currently at as a company, we've realized that this is an area that we want to put a big bet in. So obviously, Azure Data Studio has kind of led the way here in terms of having these richer notebook experiences, exploring things such as Jupyter Books, WYSIWYG, and these kind of newer innovations around notebooks. But you also see this being adopted across Visual Studio Code, GitHub, as well as the more browser-based notebooks, such as across Azure Notebooks, which is featured in Azure ML, Synapse Studio, and so on. And what's really great here is that all of these teams are deeply collaborating to align on the scenarios that you saw mentioned earlier and make sure that you get the very similar notebook experience regardless of which tool you're currently at. So you can bet that Microsoft will be continuing to make this investment in notebooks and make presentations at major conferences like PyCon and JupyterCon and so on, and really think about how do we bring notebooks all across Microsoft experiences, because this is something we truly believe in as a company.
Thanks, Alan. So I'll be discussing the parameterization demos that we currently support, as well as up and coming new ideas for parameterization. Our main focus for parameterization was to become compatible with Papermill, as well as enhancing the experiences of automating and parameterizing notebooks in Azure Data Studio. First, we will look at Papermill's approach and how we understood and leveraged their foundations that led us to evolve our notebooks. Papermill lets us parameterize and execute notebooks. In order to do that, we need to ensure that we follow their two fundamental concepts. Tagging a cell with the tag parameters indicates that you would like to make this notebook to be parameterized. This will ensure that when you execute the notebook using either the Papermill Python API or the Papermill command line execution, it will inject the new parameters properly after the designated parameter cell. So let's see how this is done in Jupyter Notebook so that we can visually see how we tag parameter cells. So here we have a very simple notebook, which is X and Y and arithmetic and print statements. And now we can really visually see how we utilize parameterization. So here, in order to see the tags, we go to View, Cell Toolbar, Tags. And we can actually see that X and Y are stated as the parameters. And therefore, we'll be able to inject new values for these specific parameters. Now let's go to Azure Data Studio to understand how we implemented a very similar concept. So we did the same conceptualization of, indicating a cell as parameters. And by doing so, all the user will have to do is go to the more toggle for this specific cell and make it a parameter cell. So we have the exact same content, exact same tag functionality. And now we can go ahead and run this notebook and see that the addition and multiplication is outputted as that. And now, in order to understand that, how this looks in the metadata side of the notebook, we can go ahead and just look at it, take a quick peek. And so X and Y are stated here, and within the metadata for that specific cell, we see it's tagged as parameters. So therefore, when we go ahead and use the Python API execution, it will know where to inject the parameters, the newly injected parameters. So here, we're going to use the import for Papermill and execute notebook functionality, where we put an input path as well as our desired output path for that specific notebook, and then indicate the new parameter values that we want to utilize. So go ahead and run this, and then we can see that execution has completed. And now we can open up that new output notebook and see visually that the injected parameters are stated clearly, as well as the new X and Y values. The parameter cell is still there, indicating that we had parameterized that notebook from the original input. And the new values for this results are all solely based on the new injected parameters values. We can also use the command line interface for Papermill, utilizing Papermill input, output, -p for individual parameters, and setting the same format, but we'll get the exact same result. So we saw incredible potential with Papermill and how it can be used for many different notebook scenarios. Within Azure Data Studio, we not only wanted to integrate Papermill foundational approach, but we wanted to implement new methods to parameterize notebooks. So one of the ways that we actually did was utilizing the notebook URI and programmatically adding these parameters. So here you can see that this is our ADS notebook URI handler. And in order to parameterize a notebook, a user would add their specific location of their notebook, for instance on GitHub or a remote location. And then in order to inject those, all a user would have to do is append this query at the end of that notebook and state which values that they would like to change. So here we have the same exact concept of x equals 1, ampersand indicating a new parameter value, and y with a new value as well. So here we can go ahead back into Azure Data Studio, go ahead and see on our URI parameterization, closing our input notebook so we don't have to see if it's actually there or not. And we can actually see our location of our GitHub notebook as well, right? And so this notebook is something we want to parameterize. So we can go ahead and actually utilize that handler, pass it in the same way into a URL here, and say we want to inject the same values. So go ahead, open up Azure Data Studio. It recognizes that we're going to open up the same URI. Here we just download that file from that location and inject that new values based on that query at the end. So here you can clearly see that we did the exact same concept. You can run all the cells, see the exact same values from those results, and clearly understand that we follow Papermill's foundational parameterization, but incorporated it to leverage what we already implemented and now what we can also further implement. So from here, we really wanted to see how we can continue on this parameterization journey within Azure Data Studio, where we wanted to tie in all these different forms of parameterization and implement something that was very seamless to the user, and utilize our components within our notebook interface and create a simple run experience for parameterizing a notebook. And this is where our new action, run with parameters, comes in. This new action can parameterize a notebook all within this Azure Data Studio notebook. So we can quickly see here a demo of what it kind of would look like in terms of using this action. So as we see and as we've shown, the parameter cell here is just simple X and Y statement. So we can quickly go ahead and just utilize this functionality in this new button called Run with Parameters, and it will identify the parameter cell within the notebook and ask the user if they would like to change the variable and parameter value. So we're gonna say, let's change it to 10 again and Y to 20. And now I'll quickly execute and create that new parameterized notebook with the injected parameter cell, all while ensuring that we're continuously compatible and remaining on that structured foundational step of inserting this injected parameter cell after the parameter cell has been identified in the metadata. So there's quite a bit of nuance, of what we've taken from the start of Papermill to what we have now. And so now let's show an even more advanced example of parameterization. So here we're actually utilizing KQL magic, which allows us to run analysis using KQL and connect to an Azure Data Explorer cluster. So here we can see that this cluster specifically, and what we're going to look into, is storm events from the sample database. And here we actually stated the state filter to be Georgia, so that's what we're actually going to be looking at. And from here we actually ran this notebook already, since it is a bit long, to just understand what this notebook contains. So we load the KQL magic, we set up the connection to the cluster, and indicate that's the sample database that we want to actually look into. And now here I just quickly wanted to see what type of data we have within this storm event. And so we can clearly see here the different states, the different event types, injuries, damage property, different items that are all within this database itself. And so now we can see there's a bunch of this 59,000 storm events. So we can really get granular towards what we want to understand. So here, this is how we actually utilize the parameters into our KQL query, all within this notebook. So what we have to do is just state that state filter that we set to Georgia is set to this state. And then that's when we pass it into our query for KQL magic to understand that we're only looking for storm events of Georgia. So it seems like Georgia had quite a bit of thunderstorm wind, drought, hail, and many different other storm events. And we can really chart this even by looking at what the data would look like on a render chart And this is all very similar to Plotly. So this is all produced with Plotly. And here we can actually granularly just go even further in, say we only want to look closer to certain dates. It's all very interactive in this approach. So now let's say we want to go back up and add a new parameter, let's say for a new state. So all we're going to have to actually do is indicate within or using our run with parameters action what state we actually want to do. So let's say I'm currently living in Washington State. So let's do Washington. And now the part that we have to do here is actually we have to rerun the notebook for it to actually be executed. So it will be just quick, understanding of reloading KQL magic, setting up the connection. And in order to do that, we actually have to authenticate in our browser. So it's a very quick and easy, just copy and paste the code that's already pasted in. You can sign in with your email address that will allow you to connect to the Kusto client, and then just authenticate there, all within the space for us to leverage this Kusto Azure Data Explorer cluster and get that data. So I authenticated. Now we get the same kind of understanding of the data. And we can come down here, and now we can quickly see for Washington State, we had heavy snow and during this time period, heavy wind, other factors and storm events as well. And now when we look at the render chart, and we actually can even compare with Georgia, for example, and just panning out for more understanding. So we can go back and understand that's kind of the date frame, and see that, for Washington State, it had much less severe storm events during this time period as compared to the storm events of Georgia. So there's a lot that we can leverage here with parameterization, quickly parameterize notebooks, utilizing different formats that we already laid out to you of Papermill's approach using the Python API and command line interface, using our URI parameterization, which you can store this actual notebook in GitHub, different locations, and just call it with our Azure Data Studio notebook URI handler. And then now we have this run with notebooks action. So this all really ties in to how we're continuously looking at Papermill and started on that framework of targeting that cell as parameters, and then going and seeing what more implementations we can really do to help users integrate and have a more ease of use with notebooks, specifically parameterizing them and then executing them in automated fashions. So from here, we've developed and integrated many different parameterization actions, as well as usability that not only focuses on the foundations that Papermill has set up for us and leverage those to enhance our parameterization within notebooks for Azure Data Studio. So we shown all of that, and now we really wanted to understand what more and what it could be next for parameterization. So one of our goals and our next kind of items that we wanted to look at was global parameterization. So parameterizing multiple notebooks that are all contained in a Jupyter book using global parameters. And we really wanted to take this a bit further by utilizing, the Jupyter Books open source project as well, and creating those global parameters to continue with the Papermill's open source approach and really combine those two together. This will allow us to really take a notebook, take a Jupyter book, and set a set of parameters and open that notebook that already knows what those parameters would be. So let's go ahead and look at what a prototype of that would be as we continue doing user studies on this as well. So here we have Azure Data Studio, and we're going to be, opening a new Jupyter book here. So we'll click Weather Analysis, as we kind of have shown. And now we open that Jupyter book. As you can see, it's a different, it's a book here and with many different notebooks. Now we'll click on the first notebook, similar to that of what we just tested. So the storm weather analysis. And from here, what we wanted to do is set this book to look at, for all of these notebooks, a specific state. So we're going to right click that book and say set as parameters. Now we can say set parameters for Jupyter book. And these are setting the parameters for the entire book as indicated. And all we're going to do is adding the state filter in Georgia. And so when we press set, now this current notebook that we currently open will automatically add this parameter cell, as there was none initially. So now we already seen the results for Georgia, and we wanted to test something else. So now we can just go back and use a run with parameters action. Instead of Georgia, we can do, let's say, Michigan, right? And that will open up a new notebook, as we just showed, with the injected parameters. So it's all a nice seamless process from going from a global setting to a new run for that specific notebook, right? And we can compare those analysis as well. Now let's say we actually wanted to just see, like, the other annual rainfall. So as you can see, we actually still illustrate that the global parameters is still set for this notebook as well. So that's what we intend to do, and we really want to look forward to getting more feedback regarding this approach, since we're looking to improve parameterization, automation as a whole, in order to operationalize these notebooks for many different cases. And so tying this all back into a good state was continuously implement different parameterization functionalities that both makes it easy for the user, as well as our notebook environment that focuses on parameterization. These demos illustrate all our parameterization efforts and how we started off with Papermill compatibility and work towards global parameterization, all within the context of Azure Data Studio and Papermill's open source framework. And we'll continue to learn and implement new ways to operationalize notebooks.
Thank you, Vasu. Today, I wanted to give you a really cool demo of .NET Interactive. And what's really amazing is just kind of the journey of how we were able to get to this point, because it involved a very deep collaboration with our team, as well as the dev-div organization. And to kind of start off here, obviously, VS Code has been making investments in notebooks. And we can see that by downloading the Jupyter extension as shown here. You can get the notebook support right away and just be able to start using notebooks. But however, one of the latest changes and improvements that we've been able to make as a company is investments around .NET Interactive notebooks. And so by downloading .NET Interactive notebooks, this truly gives you the very first multi-language experience in a notebook. So for example, if you wanted to be able to run SQL, PowerShell, C#, all the different code cells within the same notebook, you are now able to through .NET Interactive. And one thing we really loved about working with the .NET Interactive engineering team is that they have this very extensible model so that we could contribute these different language support, such as PowerShell and such as SQL. And we worked together to make sure if there was any differences that we need to incorporate in order to have a very smooth running experience. And so, with this year, as the March Ignite, this is the very first time that we had T-SQL support in .NET Interactive, and I'm super excited to share this with all of you. So here you see a VS Code notebook with .NET Interactive, as you can see shared here. In this example, we'll be able to make a connection to a SQL Server database and then be able to run a query against it. So in this example, once you're able to make a connection, which we have represented in this connection string here, obviously not best security practices here, but this is just for the demo. So first we will add this connection, and now that we have set up this connection, we can now run a query against it. And here you go. You can now see from select star from DBO customers in this localhost database, you can start seeing some information here. Then you can also work with different visuals here as well. And this is all really great to see. Obviously, we would now be able to run SQL queries in VS Code notebooks and get the syntax highlighting IntelliSense that you would expect from a full SQL experience. But now if we take this one step further, and let's say you wanted to do the exact same thing except in PowerShell, you can now see that we have a PowerShell. Oh, sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, we now have a PowerShell cell, as you can see shared here, with the exact same information connected to the same database and run the exact same query. And let's just see if this can even run. And look at that. It was successfully run, and you now are able to see the exact same results that you saw in the SQL query above. And the real beauty of this demo is that this demonstrates that you could have these kind of alternating cells between SQL, PowerShell, C#, F#, and more languages down the road, depending on you, the customer, to let us know what languages should be supported. And this just creates this wonderful roadmap because there is no other multi-language experience like that in the notebooks ecosystem. And you could see this shown up in not only VS Code, but also in Azure Data Studio, in Azure Notebooks, Synapse Studio, Azure ML. And we are really going to be able to get this full fidelity multi-language experience. And then if you pair this with Vasu's work with parameterization, you'll be able to pass language agnostic information between these cells as well. So definitely this is going to be a big bet that you'll see light up in every notebook experience across Microsoft. And you could go ahead and try this today. You could go download the Jupyter extension and the .NET Interactive extension, and you're all set to be able to have your very first multi-language experience. Off to you, Julie.
Hi everyone, my name is Julie Koesmarno. I am a program manager in the Tools and Experiences team. Today I'm going to show you how to use notebooks in the supportability or troubleshooting scenarios. The first one is to do with the Azure Monitor Log support in Jupyter Notebooks. So this is a very brand new one. And then the second one is also new and also in preview, is the capability to launch the equivalent notebooks from a couple of the SQL Server docs directly in Azure Data Studio, so that you can simply execute these notebooks directly in Azure Data Studio against, I suppose if it's a SQL Server connection, then it's against SQL Server. Otherwise, it's the other example would be PowerShell. So more about that soon. And the third one is to do with the automation aspect. So if you have Azure SQL DB and you want to do pre-diagnostic analysis, I suppose, against your Azure SQL DB server, you can do that with Azure Serverless Architecture. So I'm going to show you how to use Azure Serverless Architecture to execute Jupyter Notebook to diagnose your SQL DB environment. Okay, let's get started with the Azure Monitor Log support in Azure Data Studio. Before we dive into it a bit deeper, this is just a recap of how you can emit log data or event log data into Log Analytics Workspace in Azure Monitor Logs. So essentially what happens is you will have two tables created for you in Log Analytics Workspace, and they're called Azure Diagnostics and Azure Metrics. And from there you can write KQL scripts, but you can also write Jupyter Notebook file so that you can do more interesting things. So for example, for onboarding or maybe for automation, or yeah, just a great troubleshooting guide sort of story here with the notebook. For you to get started, so this is the prerequisites. You want to make sure that you have enabled the diagnostic settings in Azure SQL DB. So from the portal, you can go to diagnostic settings, and then after that, you can click on add diagnostic setting here, and then just specify what kind of log data you want to start logging from your Azure SQL DB. So obviously, these are the ways that I'm showing you. I'm using Azure Portal, but you can do the same using PowerShell as well, or AZ-CLI too, which is a little bit out of scope in this presentation. Once you've enabled that, and of course the Azure Log Analytics or Log Analytics Workspace will start collect data, and you will be able to see the log data from Azure Portal as well. So for example, you can go to the portal here on the Log Analytics and click on Logs, and you'll be able to start looking at the queries available in the Log Analytics Workspace. Now, another way of doing this is to use Jupyter Notebooks, which I'm going to show you shortly. Okay, so there are two ways of connecting to Azure Monitor Logs in Azure Data Studio. So the first option is to install the Azure Monitor Logs extension, which then will allow you to connect to a Log Analytics Workspace. And it's great for browsing, querying, as well as creating a simple Jupyter Notebook to get you started. The second option is, and this is particularly very useful if you want to do more advanced capabilities, which is using Python and KQL Magic. So if you're coming from the data science sort of world, so this is probably a no-brainer, right? But if you are thinking about automating some of these things, you wanna use Python with KQL Magic to connect to Log Analytics Workspace, and also use Papermill to do the automation or execution, similar to what Vasu showed earlier, right? So I'm going to show you both ways. The first one we'll dive into the Azure Monitor Logs extension in Azure Data Studio. All right, from Azure Data Studio, especially if you're using the August release or above, you should be able to see a new extension that we've just added. So simply go to the extensions gallery and then type in Azure Monitor Logs. So Azure Monitor Logs. And when you do that, it will filter to this extension here. And because I have it installed, so I don't have to click on the install again. But if you are installing for the first time, you will see an install button. So simply click on the install button and follow the instructions. So you can then go to Connections View-It, as you see on the screen here, and create a new connection to Azure Monitor Logs or Log Analytics Workspace. So let's do that now, which is you want to go to Connection Type and choose Azure Monitor Logs. Then you want to copy and paste the Workspace ID from Azure Portal. And so let's do that here. So I've got the Workspace ID already. And then you connect using Azure Active Directory or AAD. And then just simply click Connect, and it will start creating that connection for you. So there it is. From the Azure Log Analytics Workspace in the Connections View-It, you can right-click and choose New Notebook. What it's going to do is going to create a new notebook with the kernel Log Analytics and then attach to the connection that you've established previously. So simply type in, say for example, some code here like Azure Diagnostics. So it's very nice that the IntelliSense kicks in, and then maybe we can summarize the count by perhaps category. There it is, and then maybe we can do, in case the result is super long, let's just do the first 10 rows or so. All right, so there it is, and then you can also create a chart out of the result set, like so. So perhaps we can configure the chart here to make it a little bit nicer and readable. And there it is. So essentially, now you have native Azure Monitor Log support inside Azure Data Studio, where if you want to create a notebook, you can, and very easily as well, using KQL to query the table or tables. Let me show you a notebook that I've created earlier specifically to analyze some of the activities in Azure SQL database that I have created earlier. Here's an example how I'm looking at potential sort of query or deadlock issues that cause poor performance. So essentially I'm using the Azure Matrix here which is a table to analyze the data, and then I can simply query the deadlock metric here. So let's scroll down a little bit more here. So here's another example where I'm looking at the audit event operations and see what happens. So it looks like there are quite a few database with statistics happening here compared to others. And over here, I'm analyzing the error events that happens in my Azure SQL database, where it looks like there are common errors. So let's scroll down a little bit more. So here on the 27th of July, I've got error 208 happening quite often here. So maybe that's something to look into with my queries or with my applications. And lastly, this is for auditing purposes. Say if you wanted to know, did somebody drop my table, then you can use this Azure Diagnostics table and then look for the statement that contains drop table. And you can have a look how many times drop tables happen. In fact, you can also find out who actually dropped the table too. It's just that I haven't added into the query here. So that's a very simple example of how to use Azure Monitor Logs notebook for the purpose of troubleshooting your Azure SQL services. You can also turn Azure Monitor Logs for other Azure services as well if you'd like to. So the second option that I want to show you here is to use KQL Magic inside Python. Much like what Vasu has shown you earlier, essentially it is as simple as installing KQL Magic and then reloading the KQL Magic in the notebook. Once you do that, you can then connect to the workspace. So this is an example of the way I connect to the Log Analytics Workspace that I have. Now, I happen to parameterize this notebook as well. So what that means is if I give this notebook to other people, then they can simply perhaps automate it by supplying a different workspace ID. So it's not statically set by this notebook, but in fact, it can ask user to provide the workspace ID. So the steps that I have in this notebook is very similar to the one that I showed you earlier, where it's simply just running some queries against Azure Diagnostics table, but remember to add the percentage KQL for the multi-line KQL queries. So that's the I suppose the main difference in terms of writing the queries, where you have to always prepend it with percentage KQL. And once you do that, you can do or get bar chart as well, or charts from the notebook too. And using Python and KQL Magic, the bar chart that's going to be rendered, or any charting that is going to be rendered, is actually relying on the Plotly package. So you get that rich interactive analysis or data exploration through the data visualization here. Okay, as I said earlier, this notebook actually has parameterization already configured. So what I'm going to show you now is how to execute that earlier notebook in another notebook by providing the workspace ID. So here it is. I have the cells already set up. So I'm going to run this, and then it will ask me, hey, what's your workspace ID? So I'm just going to simply paste it. And then do I want to run it in debug mode? And I said no. So all of this is actually from this code cell here. That's where the logic comes in. And now I'm ready to execute the parameterized notebook. So here I'm actually using Papermill inside a notebook to call another notebook. So I'm providing the input notebook that I wanted to run, which is the one that I showed you earlier. And then I'm going to output the execution in another notebook. And I simply use the workspace as parameter from the previous cell. So it's going to execute and take some time to finish. Okay, it looks like it's finished executing. Let's just scroll down a little bit here. make sure that we reach 100%, which means there is no error. So that's good. So now let's take a look at the output notebook that it's created. So pressing on Ctrl O and then paste the path to the output notebook. All right, there it is. So it's loading the output notebook that I've pre-executed earlier. It looks like it has added the injected parameters cell, so that's great. And this is with the value that I provided earlier as well. And let's scroll down a little bit more. It looks like the queries have been executed. We found 2 deadlocks now. And then let's scroll down a little bit more. This is the events for the different category operations of the audit events. And then we can have a look at the deadlocks. There are so many deadlocks in the past couple of months. And let's take a look at the error analysis. So it looks like there's been a couple of errors happening in the last few days or so. So there you have it. I've shown you 2 options of connecting to Log Analytics Workspace. The first one is through Azure Monitor Logs extension, and the second one is through the Python kernel with KQL Magic. And you can use option 1 and 2 however you need it. Obviously, it depends on your scenarios. If you are more in the advanced and you wanted to do more automation, I would highly recommend the Python KQL Magic. But if you're only getting started and creating these onboarding guides, make it easy for you to kind of like just, get started quickly, just use the Azure Monitor Logs extension. As you may already know, in the docs.microsoft.com, we do have a number of SQL Server articles, and some of these are in the troubleshooting nature or self-help nature. So if you want to troubleshoot your environment, you can simply take a look at the docs articles and then maybe do copy and paste code. Now, what if we can make it easier such that when you open the docs articles page, you can simply open the equivalent of that article but in notebook format in Azure Data Studio. So let's check this out. So these are 2 documents or 2 articles that we have converted to notebooks. So let's check this out. Okay, so here's the first one, MS SQL Server 35250, which is related to this error called 35250. If I scroll down a little bit, it will actually say to me that this message occurs when attempting to join secondary database to an always-on availability group. From here, there are 2 options that users can take. So the first one is to execute the steps directly in a notebook via Azure Data Studio, and the second one is to follow the steps manually. So if you follow the step manually, then what that means is you go through every single one of these and you click copy and then paste it in Azure Data Studio or SSMS, and again copy and paste it. So the first option is obviously a little bit more easier to follow because there's less copy and pasting. So let me show you what that looks like. So when you click on the open notebook in Azure Data Studio here, it's going to ask you, are you sure you want to open this URI? And you'll click say yes, open it, and yes, you want to download and open it from the path here. So what happened underneath is that for that particular docs article, we do have the equivalent notebook stored on GitHub. So this is simply opening that path on GitHub. So there it is. It launches the MS SQL Server 35250 article, but in a notebook format. And then you can go to the, obviously read the rest of the cells. So for example, here there are some comments to replace the SQL instance name. So in fact, over here you can actually, type in my SQL Server instance, and perhaps if you want to, you can modify the notebook as well and put, say, right host, and then type in SQL instance, and then run it. There it is. We have the right host SQL instance. And then you can go and read the next sets of the code cells as well, and the instructions, and make sure that you update the appropriate areas. For example, this this line here. And let me show you another article that we've also converted to Notebook, which is the troubleshoot a full transaction log. So again, there are two options here. The first one is to open Notebook in Azure Data Studio, or you can follow the step manually. Here it is. That's the equivalent notebook that I've just opened. And in this particular notebook, we're actually using SQL kernel. So the language used here is SQL. So in this particular notebook, you want to make sure that you attach to the appropriate SQL Server instance before you run the code cells. Alright, so that sums up the experience on Launch and Execute Notebook from Docs. So at the moment, we only have two articles that we've converted, and we expect you to see more. So please do give us a shout whether you like this experience or not by clicking on this GitHub issue tracker, and then make sure that you provide a feedback, thumbs up or thumbs down on the idea. Alright, last demo of the day, which is Automate Notebook Execution. And this is essentially lifted from the TSG out methodology that we actually use internally in Azure Data. So we want to make sure that we create once, use everywhere. So what we meant by that is create the content, troubleshooting content once, and hopefully we can use it everywhere for different kinds of customers, including internal and external. So with that, let's get started. So today I'm going to show you a demo to illustrate a support case system with automated troubleshooting guide execution. So troubleshooting guide is TSG, and TSG also known as playbook or runbook or standard operating procedures, depending on where you are in the industry, but also knowledge base. Now, so here it is. I'm actually using Planner to create a new task that looks like this. And then if I assign it to myself, it will run the predefined notebook when it's assigned to me. So the output that I'm expecting is once it's assigned to me, I wanted to make sure that there is already a notebook pre-executed so that when I get the ticket, I don't have to run my own diagnostics notebook or diagnostics queries. In fact, I would see the notebooks with all the output already pre-executed, which makes super efficient diagnosis, right? So essentially the flow is like this. Imagine you have Roger who actually have created a TSG notebook, and then they publish the TSG notebook to GitHub repo. So here's Roger is acting as a writer or content writer of the TSG notebook. Now, Tim from support potentially can create a task and assign it to DBA. And over here in Planner, we're actually going to use serverless architecture to run all this notebook. So we're going to be using Azure Logic Apps. We're going to be using Azure Automation to call the TSG notebook from the centralized repo, which happens to be on GitHub. Then once it's executed, it's going to be stored on Azure Storage. Once that's done, the URL of the Azure storage is going to be published back to the ticket on the Planner website. So in that way, when Gloria gets assigned the task, she can simply view the task through the notebook URI. So using the notebook URI, the notebook is going to be open in Azure Data Studio, and it will fetch the read-only copy from the Azure storage. So now I'm going to drill into a little bit deeper on the automation aspect. So here I have a Logic App service where if I click on the designer, you'll get to see the flow. So essentially, I have a trigger when a task is assigned to me or to, in this case, me as Gloria, right? Here, it will create a job, essentially an execute notebook, invoke SQL notebook job, which is the runbook name, and then it will parse the title of the task. So I wanted to make sure that in the ticket I put in the server name and database name in the title. So once that's done, passed into the Azure Automation job, the notebook will execute with that title and then parse it all, right, in the server name database name. It will then update the task details in Planner and then post the URI of that storage. So essentially, this is how it all works. And lastly, it will also send an email to the person that got assigned to the job. So in the InfoSQL Notebook Azure Automation Runbook, here's the magic happens. So when I click on the edit button here, you'll be able to see the logic behind the scenes. So let's maximize this. So as you can see, it actually takes a parameter, which is the title. And this is where the title gets parsed to server name, database name. And then the next steps after that is essentially to figure out where the notebook resides. So in this case, it's on GitHub. So I simply use the invoke web request to fetch the notebook, and then I wanted to make sure that I use invoke SQL notebook commandlet to run it against the server name database name that I parsed earlier from the title, and I use the manage identity access token to do that. And then the rest of the script here is essentially just writing it back to the Azure Storage account. Okay, so what you see from the demo here is essentially I'm using the Logic App service, and I'm also using automation account where I have defined a runbook called Invoke SQL Notebook. So that's where the PowerShell magic happens. And I use the a blob storage container to post. So here's another way of looking at this TSG ops methodology, or abstracting the way troubleshooting guides or incident response can be handled. So author could write or develop TSGs and store it in the centralized repo, and then you would have a consumer that will view and execute the TSGs. And inside the repo or validation pipeline itself, in case you have to publish it in different areas, as an example, perhaps it's a more locked down area, you can use the, for example, if it could be ADO pipeline or Azure DevOps pipeline or GitHub Action to publish to other systems. And as an author here, you can automate TSGs as part of your incident management system. So that's the one that I showed you earlier with the Logic Apps scenario. And the consumer can just simply view the TSG output. Now, in this case, the author and consumer personas could be the same person. So yeah, so this is an example of incident management workflow with notebooks using TSG ops methodology. Okay, let's see the real life action of the scenario itself. So here I do have Planner, and I can create a task. So let's say DPS 2021, and then I want to make sure that I copy and pasted the path to my SQL DB server and database. So let me just add a task here, and then click on it to see it in greater details. So here it is, DPS 2021, my database server, and my database name. So it has nothing right now, so I'm just going to say, help me diagnose this issue. All right, so because I have the Logic Apps all set up, so this should be running nicely in the background once I assign it to me. Okay, now that it's assigned to me, I'm just simply going to close it and wait for a few moments for the Logic Apps to kick in. So it looks like the automation has kicked in and it has run my notebook. And so what I can do then is simply copy this and then go back to Azure Data Studio. Click on Open File, or simply do Ctrl-O, and then just paste the path from the planner. Right, so now I just downloaded the notebook from the Azure Blob Storage, so it's going to load here. So essentially, this notebook is borrowed from Glenberry's Azure SQL Database Diagnostic Information Queries, and it should be using SQL kernel. And because it's already pre-executed, you should be able to see the queries as well as the result set. Here's an example of a query with individual file sizes and space available for the current database. I can expand the query itself, and then I can see the result sets, and I can also see how to interpret this result set or the output of the query for my analysis or for my diagnostics. So there you have it. I've shown you how you can use Azure Logic Apps, Azure Automation to pre-execute notebooks simply, and you can even automate it so that the task gets emailed to you along with the notebook output URI that you can open. As I mentioned earlier, as part of the Azure Logic Apps, it's also emailed the task to me as well as the link to the pre-executed notebook. So here it is where I have diagnostic output TSC notebook, and then I click on the click to view in Azure Data Studio. So if I hover here, you can see that it is actually using Azure Data Studio URI, and the URL is essentially the link to my blob storage path for that notebook. So if I click on this, it will ask me if I wanted to open it, and I click say yes, and it will ask me if I wanted to open the that notebook, and I would say yes, I want to open it. So it's just going to open a second copy from a new copy of the of that diagnostic notebook. So in fact, this is probably one of the easier way of allowing you to open the notebooks directly, which is through the Azure Data Studio URI. All right, so to recap a little bit here, so you can do automation in notebooks for troubleshooting scenarios. Today, I actually showed you how to do auto diagnosis scenario, but you can also do auto detection and auto mitigation, which are actually out of scope today. And auto detection is that it just runs on timer and then detects something, and then it files a ticket. And then perhaps you can also have the diagnosis as part of that ticket creation. And auto mitigation is, as what the name suggests, essentially if there is a specific ticket with a specific characteristics, you want to run a notebook that mitigates the issue automatically. Essentially, the automation notebook is based on a number of concepts that we talked throughout this demo. So the first one is parameterization, which Vasu talked about earlier. So here are some of the useful resources for you to get started. And this is specifically very helpful for the Python sort of world, but you can also use for PowerShell as well if you need to. And then in the demo that I showed you earlier with the automation, I actually use Invoke SQL Notebook, which is part of the SQL Server module. So this is using PowerShell. So the code snippet that I'm showing you here is essentially an example of how you can run a notebook against multiple databases or instances. And if you are using PowerShell Notebook instead of a SQL Notebook, then you can use the Invoke Execute Notebook that can be parameterized. So to recap on the CLI-based notebook execution, for Python kernel, use Papermill. For SQL kernel, use Invoke SQL Notebook. And then for PowerShell Notebook, use Invoke Execute Notebook. But you want to be sure that you are using PowerShell 7.1 or greater for the Invoke Execute Notebook. With that, I'd like to summarize what I've shown you today, how you can use Notebook for troubleshooting guides. So the first one is using Azure Monitor Logs to analyze your Azure SQL event logs. And then the second one is using the notebooks from SQL Server Docs to launch and execute the equivalent notebooks in Azure Data Studio. And the third one is to automate notebook execution using serverless architecture. All right, folks, we are at the end of the session, so let's summarize the lessons that you have learned and share with you some of the resources that you can take a look after. So let's take a quick recap here. Alan has shared with you the notebook landscape in Azure Data Studio, and he also shared the .NET Interactive SQL in VS Code experiences. And then Vasu has talked about parameterization, which I then follow with sharing the notebook execution, notebook automation, especially in the troubleshooting scenarios. And don't forget to try out the SQL Docs to Notebooks experience from a couple of the articles that I shared earlier. Now with that, these are the summary of useful resources as well. So make sure that you check out Azure Data Studio and go to the Azure Data Studio GitHub in case you have any feedback for us, and follow us on Twitter at Azure Data Studio. And last but not least, we'd like to thank you for attending this session. Hopefully this has been useful.